White cop stops black billionaire driving a luxury car. His career ends when he learns who it is. In the bustling streets of Philadelphia, a routine traffic stop would normally be little more than a footnote in the daily news, except when it isn't routine at all. On this fateful afternoon, Officer Todd Harrison pulls over a sleek, obsidian black luxury car, convinced something nefarious must be afoot. Unbeknownst to him, the driver is Ebony Brooks, an accomplished black woman whose identity and family ties will catapult this seemingly ordinary traffic stop into a national firestorm. Twisting truths, hidden prejudices, and a sudden, shocking revelation ignite a battle that threatens to unravel the very foundations of the Philadelphia Police Department and Todd's life. Philadelphia in early summer can be overwhelming. The heat makes the pavement shimmer, and the dense humidity seems to glue people to the sidewalks. The city pulses with life. Vendors selling water ice on street corners, families hustling to find shade in Fairmount Park, and business people rushing to catch trains at Suburban Station. Tucked between gleaming skyscrapers and centuries-old architecture, a delicate balance exists. Philadelphia is a city that embraces both tradition and progress, resilience and reinvention. Ebony Brooks spent her morning at a business conference at the Pennsylvania Convention Center, discussing a new philanthropic initiative aimed at improving education programs for underprivileged youth. A formidable presence in her own right, Ebony was born and raised in the city's Germantown neighborhood before heading off to Howard University for her undergraduate degree, then Yale Law for her Juris Doctor. In the span of a decade, she had built a reputation as one of Philadelphia's most respected corporate attorneys, eventually branching into philanthropy. Her success was far from accidental. Every rung she climbed on the socio-economic ladder had been carved out by her ceaseless ambition. She worked long hours as a junior associate at a white-shoe law firm, endured microaggressions, overcame countless obstacles, and gradually rose to become partner. Then, seeking a more meaningful path, she pivoted to philanthropic work, partnering with the city's largest nonprofits to drive positive change in overlooked communities. She had personal reasons for focusing on these issues. Ebony's mother, Dr. Helena Brooks, was a widely respected child psychologist whose research on community health had even influenced policy at the federal level. Her father, Reggie Brooks, was a decorated Marine veteran turned city councilman, known for championing social justice initiatives. On this sweltering day, Ebony felt light, almost triumphant. Her conference presentation had been a success, drawing enthusiastic support from local businesses and community leaders. As she waved goodbye to the last of the attendees in the cavernous hallway of the convention center, she reminded herself to stay humble. After all, her success wasn't about accolades, it was about changing the course of lives once limited by systemic barriers. Stepping outside, Ebony squinted against the brightness of the sun reflecting off the glass facade of the nearby Comcast Center. The unwavering summer haze made her yearn for some cold air conditioning. Sliding into her obsidian black Mercedes S-Class, a gift she had purchased for herself after one of her biggest corporate legal wins, she let out a small sigh of relief. It was a car that symbolized just how far she'd come, but also how much she had left to do. In another part of the city, Officer Todd Harrison was patrolling in his cruiser. Todd was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a square jaw and a pair of eyes set in a perpetual squint. He was in his mid-30s, having spent the past decade with the Philadelphia Police Department. Though he'd never risen beyond the rank of patrol officer, he nursed an unspoken resentment at watching younger, more diverse colleagues climb the ladder. This was a day like any other, until their paths crossed on the busy intersection of Broad Street and JFK Boulevard. Officer Todd Harrison had been circling the area near City Hall for the last hour, watching for reckless drivers or expired registrations. Underneath his pressed uniform, he felt the slow creep of sweat trickling down his back. The tinted windows and plush interior of his cruiser provided little relief from the sweltering heat outside. With the radio playing the day's dispatch chatter, Todd's mind drifted to his own frustrations. He was almost certain that the department was overlooking his talents. Why else had he not received the promotions he felt he deserved? As if to reinforce his mounting bitterness, Todd's gaze fixed on a black Mercedes gliding smoothly through the midday traffic. It was an S-Class, brand new from the looks of it. There was a moment, a fleeting second, in which Todd noted how effortlessly the driver switched lanes, how confidently the car maneuvered. Then the darker instinct crept in, suspicion. Even with little reason, Todd found himself thinking, who's behind the wheel? Shaking off the heat-induced grogginess, Todd flashed his lights. He told himself it was a routine check, but in the recesses of his mind he couldn't deny the pang of prejudice. Statistically, he reasoned, a high-end luxury car in this area might be driven by someone with a questionable past, or possibly even involved in some kind of illegal activity. Todd's suspicions always seemed to magnetize toward certain demographics, though he'd never admit this to anyone, not even his wife. As Ebony navigated past City Hall, she caught sight of red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Immediately, she felt a flutter of apprehension in her stomach. The reason for the stop wasn't clear. She'd carefully abided by all traffic laws. Nonetheless, she signaled and pulled over at the nearest curb, her heart rate quickening. She knew far too well how routine traffic stops could escalate, especially for a black driver in a predominantly white area. Todd parked behind her Mercedes and approached, hand resting on his belt. He kept a measured, stern expression. Ebony lowered her window halfway, ready to hand over her registration and license. "Good afternoon, officer," Ebony said politely, her tone calm but tight with tension. "Is there an issue?" Todd looked her over. Ebony's neatly pressed business suit, the sleek interior, her poised demeanor, all of it momentarily threw him off. He had been expecting someone younger, maybe sporting flashy jewelry or wearing a basketball jersey. Instead, Ebony exuded an aura of professionalism and confidence. Nonetheless, Todd stuck to his script. "I need to see your license and registration," he said in a flat voice. "Also, proof of insurance." Ebony offered him the documents. "I'm not sure why I'm being stopped. Can you tell me what's going on?" Todd paused. He flipped through her license and registration, his brow furrowing slightly. Everything was in order. Ebony waited, her eyes never leaving his. In those seconds, the tension felt almost tangible, like a spark in the air, about to catch flame. "I'll let you know in a minute," Todd finally responded. He walked back to his cruiser with her paperwork, leaving Ebony in limbo. Sitting alone, Ebony exhaled slowly. She'd had enough interactions with law enforcement to know when she was being profiled. A distant memory of her father's admonitions echoed in her mind. "Keep your calm. Don't let them rattle you." She was determined not to let an unwarranted traffic stop define her day or her identity. From his cruiser, Todd conducted a standard check on Ebony's license. Nothing came up, no warrants, no priors. It was entirely clean. He felt a pinprick of discomfort. Now he needed a reason, any reason, to justify this stop. Otherwise he would appear incompetent or, worse, prejudiced. He stepped out of his car again, steeling himself for the conversation to come. Stepping up to Ebony's car for the second time, Todd cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I pulled you over because it looked like you switched lanes without signaling." Ebony's brows drew together. She remembered signaling clearly. She was meticulous about traffic rules, if only to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. She was about to speak when she realized that no matter what she said, Todd would likely dig his heels in. Confrontation wouldn't serve her well. "I see," Ebony replied, measuring her words. "I'm fairly certain I used my turn signal, but I respect your authority if you say otherwise." Todd's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he was trying to detect any hint of sarcasm or hostility in Ebony's voice. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Ebony shook her head. "I'm just a bit surprised. Could I please receive a warning if that's truly the issue? I have a clean record, and I'd like to continue on my way." Todd took a moment, weighing her request. There was a temptation to double down, to assert control over this situation, to show her who had the upper hand. Yet he also realized how tenuous his justification was. "I might be able to let you off with a warning," Todd said, his tone not quite yielding. "But first, I need to confirm there are no other issues. It's not every day I see a car like this, especially if it's not being driven by, well, by an older professional, you know." Ebony caught the implication instantly, feeling the familiar sting. "I'm an attorney, officer." Let me guess," Todd cut in. "A defense attorney who spends a lot of time trying to get criminals off the hook." In that moment, Ebony realized she was dealing with someone who might be spoiling for a fight. But she kept her voice steady. "Corporate and philanthropic law, actually. Not all lawyers do criminal defense." Todd grunted. He was about to retreat to his cruiser once more when Ebony's phone, lying on the passenger seat, began to vibrate. She instinctively reached to silence it, just as Todd glanced in. He froze. There was a hint of suspicion again, as though the phone's ringing was a red flag rather than an innocuous occurrence. "You on your phone while I'm talking to you? Are you recording this?" Ebony blinked. "I wasn't, but I—" "Step out of the vehicle," Todd demanded, the tension in his voice ramping up. The shift from mild suspicion to open hostility happened fast. Ebony unbuckled her seatbelt, her chest tightening. She'd always known that traffic stops could turn on a dime, but it was one thing to read headlines and another to live the moment in real time. "You can keep your hands where I can see them," Todd added, stepping back and pressing a hand to his belt near his holster. Ebony's pulse raced, but she maintained her composure. She opened the car door slowly, stepping out in her pressed navy blazer and matching skirt. Standing on the sidewalk under the scorching sun, Ebony felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. How had she ended up in this situation? She was Ebony Brooks, a law-abiding citizen, a Harvard-educated, or rather Yale-educated attorney with philanthropic ties across the city. Yet here she was, being treated like a suspect. Todd gestured for her to stand near the hood of her car. The street was alive with onlookers. Some slowed their pace, curious about what was unfolding. Ebony tried to keep her gaze forward, ignoring the embarrassment and rising anger gnawing at her gut. "Stay right there," Todd said sharply. He pressed the dispatch button on his radio, calling for backup. The midday sun bore down on Ebony's shoulders as she stood beside her Mercedes. A crowd of passers-by had started to form a loose semicircle, some filming on their phones. The tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Todd, one hand on his belt, the other occasionally resting on the cruiser's open door, appeared poised for confrontation. Moments later, a second police car arrived, lights spinning in the thick afternoon. Two more officers stepped out, a middle-aged woman named Officer Diana Morales, with a streak of silver in her hair, and a younger man, Officer Brian Chang, fresh-faced and visibly uneasy as he took in the scene. They approached Todd, who gestured to Ebony. "I pulled her over for a traffic violation," Todd explained, "but I have reason to believe there might be more going on." Officer Morales raised an eyebrow. "Did you search the vehicle?" "Not yet," Todd replied tersely. Ebony's eyes flickered with alarm. "On what grounds would you search my vehicle?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. She knew her rights. There was no probable cause here. Officer Morales stepped forward, scanning Ebony from head to toe. Sensing the tension, she kept her voice measured. "Ma'am, do you mind telling us if you have anything illegal in your car? Any weapons or narcotics?" Ebony resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "Absolutely not. And I do mind because there is no cause to search my vehicle. I haven't done anything wrong. My record is clean, and my license and registration are up to date." Officer Chang's gaze darted between Ebony and Todd as if he could sense the undercurrent of something deeper. Todd, however, seemed intent on forging ahead. Facts be damned. "We can't be too careful," Todd insisted. "A high-end car, tinted windows, possible evasive maneuvers." "I signaled," Ebony cut in firmly, "and my windows are within the legal tint limit. If you're accusing me of something else, state it clearly." The onlookers whispered among themselves. Some had their phones raised, capturing every second. Officer Morales laid a gentle hand on Todd's shoulder. "Let me talk to her," she said softly, stepping forward. "Ma'am," Morales began, her voice a shade more conciliatory, "we're just trying to do our jobs. If you could show us some understanding, maybe cooperate with a quick look." "A quick look, meaning what exactly?" Ebony's anger flared at the suggestion. "I understand police protocol, but let me ask you this. If I was a white woman in a fancy car, would we still be having this conversation?" Officer Morales hesitated, glancing at Todd. "We're not here to discuss race." "Seems like that's exactly what we're here to discuss," Ebony shot back, her composure beginning to falter. "Look at all these people filming. This is going to be on social media in minutes." Todd gritted his teeth. He didn't like feeling out of control. He stepped closer, overshadowing Ebony with his larger frame. "Lower your voice," he growled. Ebony refused to step back, her chin lifted defiantly. "Officer, if you have grounds to arrest me, do it. Otherwise, let me go." Officer Chang cleared his throat. "Todd, maybe we should just give her a warning about the lane switch and let her—" "No," Todd snapped. "We proceed with the search." A hush fell over the small crowd. Ebony's heart thudded in her chest. She could feel her phone vibrating in her blazer pocket, likely her assistant, or maybe one of her colleagues, who saw the commotion on the street. In that moment, Ebony felt a surge of righteous indignation. This was not how a law-abiding citizen should be treated. "Then I'd like to call my attorney," Ebony stated, pulling out her phone. "I have that right." Todd's lips curled into something like a sneer. "Go ahead. Call whoever you want." Officer Morales and Officer Chang exchanged uneasy glances. As Ebony raised the phone to her ear, Todd stood there, arms folded over his chest, his eyes burning with a mixture of suspicion and challenge. He had no clue just who Ebony Brooks might call, and how that one phone call would soon shatter the fragile illusion of control he so desperately clung to. Ebony's phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Yvette here. Ebony, what's going on?" came the crisp, familiar voice of her colleague and close friend, Yvette Hightower. Yvette was also an attorney, specializing in civil rights litigation, and had extensive experience with police misconduct cases. "Yvette, I'm on Broad and JFK, stopped by the police for a supposed traffic violation. They're threatening a search of my car without cause," Ebony said, loud enough for Todd and the others to hear. "What?" Yvette's voice rang with alarm. "Stay calm. Put me on speaker." Ebony pressed a button, and Yvette's voice echoed in the tense afternoon air. "Officers, I'm Yvette Hightower, attorney at law. I'm calling to inform you that any search without proper probable cause will be considered a violation of Ms. Brooks' constitutional rights. Now, do you have a warrant or probable cause?" Todd's face reddened. The crowd pressed in closer, phones still raised. He could feel sweat gathering on his brow, his collar suddenly stifling. "We're just following procedure," he muttered. "She was pulled over for a lane violation, which is a minor traffic infraction," Yvette interjected. "That does not justify a search. If you proceed, you will be exposing the department to a lawsuit." Officer Morales cast Todd a look of thinly veiled caution. "Let's think this through," she murmured. But Todd had already stepped too far into the quicksand of his own making. Stepping away from the phone, he leaned toward Ebony. "Listen," he said, in a voice that tried to be menacing but cracked under pressure. "I don't care who your friend is. As far as I'm concerned, you're resisting an investigation." Ebony clenched her teeth. "I'm asserting my rights, officer. That's not resisting." She could see the faint flicker of doubt cross Todd's eyes. The world was watching, literally, with a ring of smartphones capturing every word. For a moment, Ebony felt certain Todd would back down. Then, in a sudden surge of aggression, Todd reached for Ebony's arm. "We're going to put you in the cruiser while we conduct our check," he declared. Instinctively, Ebony jerked away. Officer Morales stepped forward, her voice loud now. "Todd, don't—" But Todd was past the point of reason. His grip closed around Ebony's wrist. Ebony let out a sharp gasp, more from shock than pain. The onlookers erupted in a cacophony of angry shouts and exclamations, some urging Ebony to stay calm, others yelling at Todd to let her go. "Let me go," Ebony demanded, trying to keep her voice steady even as her heart pounded in her ears. Officer Chang grabbed Todd's shoulder, pulling him back. "Todd, stop," he shouted. "We're going too far." In that instant, Ebony seized the brief chance to yank her arm free. She stumbled backward, her phone hitting the pavement with a crack. Yvette's voice was still on speaker, though muffled now. Ebony found herself inches from the crowd, shoulders heaving with adrenaline. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. "This is illegal," someone shouted. "She didn't do anything," cried another. Todd glared at Ebony, his hand hovering near his belt again, a dangerous glimmer in his eyes. The standoff stretched into a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity. Finally, Officer Morales stepped between them, facing Todd. "Stop," she hissed, low enough that only he and Ebony could hear. "You're on camera. If we escalate this, it's on us. We have no grounds." Todd's nostrils flared, his chest rising and falling in fury. For a moment it looked as though he would push Morales aside and finish what he started. Then he caught a glimpse of the crowd, furious, recording everything. He saw Ebony, trembling not from fear but from seething anger and the realization that she was close to being assaulted by a police officer. He felt Officer Chang's grip on his shoulder, a silent plea to step back from the brink. Finally, Todd let out a ragged breath. His arm relaxed, hand moving away from the belt. He turned sharply on his heel, storming back to his cruiser. "We're done here," he barked. "Give her a damn citation if you want. I'm out." Officer Morales sighed, relief flooding her tense posture. She looked at Ebony with a mix of apology and frustration, then nodded to Chang. "Just write the ticket and let her go." Shaken but resolute, Ebony picked up her phone from the ground. The screen was cracked, but Yvette's voice still came through. "Ebony, Ebony." "I'm okay," Ebony managed, placing the phone to her ear. "I'll call you back. I have to handle something." Todd sat in his cruiser, eyes locked on Ebony through the windshield, heart pounding with equal measures of anger and dread. He had no idea how deeply this moment would affect his career and his life. All he knew was that the calm, confident woman he had just manhandled wasn't going to let this go quietly. By the time Ebony arrived at her office in Center City, her hands were still shaking. She headed straight to the private restroom attached to her corner suite. Gripping the marble countertop, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The reflection staring back at her in the mirror was one of outrage and exhaustion. Her hair, neatly styled that morning, showed a few strands out of place, and her blazer bore wrinkles where Todd had grabbed her. The phone in her blazer pocket vibrated. Ebony exhaled and answered. It was Yvette calling back. "Ebony, I'm heading over. We have to file a complaint. We have witnesses, phone footage. This is a clear case of racial profiling and harassment." "I know," Ebony said softly, "and we will. But first, I need to speak with my father." She hung up, quickly dialing another number. After a brief exchange with the secretary, she was connected. "Daddy," Ebony said when she heard his familiar baritone, "I'm sorry to bother you during your city council session, but something happened." Her father, Reggie Brooks, an influential city councilman, listened in stunned silence as Ebony recounted her ordeal. By the end of her story, his voice was trembling with protective fury. "Where are you now?" "In my office, safe," Ebony replied. "Officer Todd Harrison, that's the name on the badge. I have it all documented, and there's video from bystanders." Reggie Brooks let out a slow, controlled breath. "I'm going to call the commissioner's office immediately. You just sit tight. Let Yvette gather the materials." Ebony nodded, even though she knew he couldn't see her. "I'll do that. Thank you, Daddy." As she ended the call, Ebony felt a heaviness in her chest. She didn't want special favors. She never had. But years of watching her father fight for justice, for equity, for the dignity of every Philadelphian, she knew that sometimes you had to use every resource at your disposal to right a wrong. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, Todd Harrison was slumped in a worn leather chair in the small break room, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. His partner for the day, Officer Kevin Rudolph, walked in, eyebrows arched. "I heard you had quite the situation downtown." Todd scowled. "I'm not talking about it." Rudolph nodded knowingly. "Chief wants to see you. Something about a complaint filed by the woman you stopped." Todd felt his stomach drop. "Already? She wasn't even arrested." Rudolph shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Word spreads fast nowadays, especially if there was filming." Begrudgingly, Todd stood. "Fine, let's get it over with." In the chief's office, Todd's heart pounded uncomfortably. Chief Carla West was a formidable woman, known for her strict adherence to protocol and her intolerance for any whiff of misconduct. She had served in the force for nearly 30 years, climbing the ranks through diligence and an impeccable record. She looked at Todd from behind her desk, her eyes flat. "Officer Harrison, a complaint has been filed against you. The city councilman, Reggie Brooks, called me personally. The citizen you stopped is his daughter, Ebony Brooks." Todd stiffened, jaw tightening. I didn't know who she was." "That shouldn't matter," Chief West retorted. "Mr. Brooks says he has video evidence of you using excessive force. Let me be clear. I won't tolerate racial profiling or any abuse of authority within my department. I've opened an internal affairs investigation. You'll remain on duty, but be prepared to answer some serious questions." Todd opened his mouth to protest, but the sharp look in the chief's eyes silenced him. "No one said you have to stand trial yet," she added more evenly. "But if you're found at fault, the consequences will be severe." After being dismissed, Todd stormed out of her office. His mind was reeling. This was worse than he'd imagined. He'd heard the name Reggie Brooks before. Everyone had. Brooks was a well-respected councilman known for championing social justice reforms and having the ear of the mayor. Todd's frustration gave way to a cold, creeping dread. He had poked a hornet's nest. Back in her high-rise office, Ebony answered a final call for the day, this time from her mother, Dr. Helena Brooks. A wave of comfort washed over Ebony as she heard the concern in her mother's voice. "Baby, are you all right? Your father told me what happened." "Just shaken up," Ebony admitted. "I'll be fine, but this can't go unaddressed, Mom." "It won't," Dr. Brooks said quietly. "Your father and I are behind you all the way. We're going to make sure justice is served. That officer chose the wrong woman to mess with." Ebony closed her eyes, tears threatening to fall. She knew she had resources that many others didn't. Parents in positions of power, a robust legal network, and she couldn't help thinking about those without such advantages who faced this kind of harassment every day with no one to call. That sobering realization steeled her resolve. She would see this through, not just for herself, but for all those who had endured this type of injustice. For Todd Harrison, this was the beginning of a nightmare. For Ebony Brooks, it was a battle she had never asked for, but one she was prepared to fight and win. The next morning, Philadelphia's local news outlets buzzed with headlines. City councilman's daughter alleges police misconduct. Video of controversial traffic stop goes viral. Questions of racial profiling in PPD. Ebony's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her email inbox swelled with messages of support, legal inquiries, and requests for interviews. Yvette Hightower, ever the efficient organizer, had already arranged a press conference for that afternoon. Standing in front of a row of cameras at City Hall's courtyard, Ebony faced a throng of reporters. The sun beat down mercilessly, but she stood tall, flanked by Yvette and her father. The cameras clicked and whirred. Live streams captured every word she spoke. "I'm here today not just as the daughter of Councilman Brooks, but as a citizen of Philadelphia," Ebony began, her voice unwavering. "Yesterday, I was pulled over without just cause, physically handled, and threatened with an unlawful search. My experience highlights a systemic issue that too many people, especially black men and women, face on our streets." A murmur rose from the assembled journalists. One raised a hand. Ms. Brooks, do you believe this was a racially motivated stop? Ebony paused, her gaze drifting momentarily over the crowd. Officer Todd Harrison's actions reflect a deep-seated bias, whether conscious or unconscious. The facts speak for themselves. But I'm also here to say that we must hold not only individual officers accountable, but the system that enables such behavior. Reggie Brooks took the podium next, his voice resonating with the practiced confidence of a seasoned politician. I have faith in the Philadelphia Police Department's ability to serve and protect all residents equally. However, we cannot ignore the repeated instances of profiling and misconduct. My daughter's incident will not be brushed under the rug. We demand a thorough investigation, and if evidence supports it, we demand accountability. Back at the precinct, Todd Harrison watched the press conference on a television mounted in the corner of the station's common area. His stomach churned. The chief had called him in for a meeting with Internal Affairs later that day, and he could feel the eyes of his colleagues drifting toward him, some with pity, others with thinly veiled judgment. Officer Morales approached him cautiously. "Todd, you better get a lawyer. This is blowing up." He shot her a venomous glare. "I didn't do anything wrong except my job. She was acting suspicious." Morales sighed, choosing her words carefully. "That's not what the video shows." "It's all over Twitter and YouTube, Todd. You grabbed her, she pulled away. I'm sorry, but it looks bad." "Are you on her side?" Todd snapped. "I'm on the side of reason," Morales retorted, her tone clipped. "And I'm trying to help you see the reality here before it's too late." Todd stormed away, his mind racing. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Checking the screen, he saw multiple missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. He suspected they were reporters, looking for a statement. Then came a text from his wife, Linda. "We need to talk. Call me when you can." Tension knotted his shoulders. Linda worked at a local news station as a producer. She had undoubtedly received wind of the story. Todd felt cornered and alone, but he was too angry and proud to back down, too fearful to admit maybe he'd crossed a line. By late afternoon, Ebony's press conference had started trending on social media. Major networks picked it up in their evening broadcasts. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a detailed piece that included Ebony's background, Todd Harrison's name, and the department's initial statement. Internal Affairs confirmed an investigation was underway, but the damage to Todd's reputation had already begun. Across living rooms in Philadelphia and beyond, footage of him aggressively grabbing Ebony circulated, fueling debates on talk shows and online forums. When Ebony returned to her office, she found a flood of supportive emails from strangers, mothers, students, activists, thanking her for standing up. She also found hate mail, messages calling her a liar, an opportunist, or worse. The hateful words stung, a reminder that shining a light on injustice often invites malice. But Ebony refused to back down. As she closed her office door and leaned against it, she silently renewed her vow. She would use her platform not only to seek justice for herself, but to highlight the broader issue of racial profiling. She was determined not to let Todd Harrison's actions be swept under the rug. Todd Harrison's journey to becoming a police officer had been fueled by both admiration and desperation. His father, Glenn Harrison, had been a decorated detective with the Philadelphia Police Department for over 25 years. Growing up, Todd was in awe of his father's uniform, the stories of thwarted criminals, and the respect Glenn commanded in their neighborhood. But behind the closed door of their modest row home in northeast Philly, life was far from idyllic. Glenn was a strict, often harsh man who demanded perfection from his son. "You want to wear this badge someday," he'd say. "You'd better learn how to handle people." After Glenn's death from a sudden heart attack, Todd felt compelled to follow in his footsteps, partly out of reverence, partly to gain the validation he never fully received. He graduated from the police academy with decent marks, nothing stellar. Over time, Todd grew frustrated. He watched more progressive officers get promoted, often individuals who championed community outreach and sensitivity training. He felt overlooked, convinced that the department's new wave of political correctness was leaving old-school policing behind. This lingering bitterness gnawed at Todd's psyche. He took each day on the job as a test, a chance to prove he was upholding the real legacy of policing, taking a tough stance on crime. But in the process, his worldview narrowed. He saw the city's problems in black and white terms, convinced that anyone behind the wheel of an expensive car, without looking like they belonged, had to be up to no good. Adding to the weight of his discontent, Todd's marriage had been strained for the past few years. Linda worked long hours in media production, pushing for a bigger position at the news station. Their schedules rarely aligned, and when they did, it often ended in arguments about money, unfulfilled aspirations, or Todd's simmering resentment about feeling stuck. Now, as Todd sat in a small interrogation room with two internal affairs investigators, Lieutenant Marlena Green and Sergeant Ken Leary, he felt all those unresolved tensions colliding with his current crisis. He shifted uncomfortably in the stiff chair. The fluorescent lights above hummed, casting an unflattering glare on his perspiring face. Lieutenant Green began, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Harrison, we have reviewed video footage from multiple angles. It clearly shows you initiating physical contact with Missy Ebony Brooks. Can you explain why you believed that was necessary?" Todd swallowed hard. She was resisting my questions, reaching for her phone. "It could have been a weapon. I didn't know." Sergeant Leary frowned. "But there was no indication of a weapon in the video. She was cooperating up until you demanded to search her car." Todd felt cornered. "Look, I had a hunch. She was acting defiant. And defiance alone justifies physical force." Lieutenant Green pressed. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Todd had no good answer. He tried to muster some semblance of defense. "I was following procedure. If you watch the footage carefully, you'll see she yanked her arm away first." Sergeant Leary cut him off, voice tight. "Officer Harrison, you escalated the situation. We have multiple eyewitness accounts stating you threatened a search without probable cause. This is a serious violation. If proven, it could lead to disciplinary action up to and including dismissal from the force." Todd's face paled. He could almost hear his father's voice echoing from the past. "Stay strong. Don't let them tear you down." Yet he was painfully aware that the department's old guard no longer held the sway it once did. The city had grown weary of headlines about police misconduct. After the meeting adjourned, Todd stepped out into the corridor, feeling a cold sweat break out under his uniform. The hearing wasn't over. More interviews, more investigations, more scrutiny lay ahead. The shadow of Ebony Brooks loomed large, and deep down, a small, uncomfortable voice whispered that he had indeed profiled her, that he had let his biases override his duty to serve and protect fairly. But Todd Harrison, mired in the weight of his father's legacy and his own wounded pride, wasn't ready to admit that, at least not yet. In the days following the incident, the Philadelphia Police Department found itself in a firestorm of controversy. Public criticism was harsh and swift, fueled by viral videos and social media commentary. A formal internal investigation was underway, but the court of public opinion was already issuing a damning verdict. Chief Carla West convened an emergency meeting with her senior staff, including the heads of internal affairs, public relations, and community outreach. The briefing room buzzed with tension as charts, graphs, and memos were spread out on the central table. Officer morale was dipping. Protests were forming outside precincts in solidarity with Ebony Brooks. The chief stood at the front of the room, her posture stiff. "Our department is in crisis mode," she began. "We have to handle this carefully. The city is demanding not just accountability, but deeper reforms. Councilman Brooks is leading the charge, and he has strong public support." Captain Ruiz, who oversaw community outreach, flipped through pages of data. "We're seeing a sharp uptick in complaints alleging profiling. People are coming forward with older cases, claiming they were ignored or dismissed." The chief nodded grimly. "We need to address that. We can't bury our heads in the sand. The mayor's office has asked us to review all of our policy guidelines on stops, searches, and use of force. They've also requested we expedite the body camera program." In another corner of the room, Lieutenant Green from Internal Affairs spoke up. "We're gathering all the evidence regarding Officer Harrison's actions. The preliminary findings suggest he violated several departmental protocols. We've interviewed him, and his statements conflict with the video evidence." The chief let out a slow breath. "We have to take decisive action. If we don't, we'll lose what little trust the community still has in us." Meanwhile, outside the police headquarters, protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Ebony" and "End racial profiling now." Ebony herself was not present. She was meeting with legal counsel to finalize the next steps. But her presence was felt everywhere in the city, from editorial pieces in the Philadelphia Inquirer to talk radio debates. Within the station, Todd Harrison found himself ostracized. Some younger officers viewed him as a symbol of the force's outdated practices, someone who refused to adapt to the changing times. Others, mostly the older guard, quietly supported Todd, grumbling about politics and civilians who don't understand real police work. Yet even among them, few dared to publicly defend him. The pressure from the top was too immense. One morning, Todd arrived at his locker to find it defaced. Scrawled in black marker was a phrase that stung more than the public outcry. "You're done." Todd swallowed, gripping the cold metal of the locker handle. A swirl of anger and fear collided in his stomach. He slammed the locker shut, the clang echoing down the hallway. A mandatory meeting with the department psychologist followed. Todd endured a perfunctory conversation about stress management, feeling even more isolated. Every step he took, he felt eyes upon him, some glaring, others pitying. He considered taking a leave of absence, but pride and stubbornness held him back. As the department scrambled to implement new guidelines and quell public unrest, the fate of Todd Harrison loomed like a dark cloud. The city was demanding action, accountability, and meaningful change. And in the crosshairs stood the officer whose split-second decision had sparked a crisis, threatening not only his own career, but also casting an unflattering spotlight on the entire Philadelphia Police Department. The courthouse on Filbert Street was a flurry of activity. Reporters lined the steps, microphones in hand, awaiting the arrival of Ebony Brooks, Yvette Hightower, and the legal team. After nearly 2 weeks of media buzz and behind-the-scenes negotiations, Ebony had decided to file a civil lawsuit against Officer Todd Harrison and the Philadelphia Police Department for violation of her civil rights and emotional distress. Inside the polished marble lobby, Ebony's heels clicked with determined precision as she made her way through the security checkpoint. Yvette walked beside her, holding a leather briefcase bulging with files. A small entourage of supporters and fellow attorneys followed close behind. "Are you ready?" Yvette asked quietly, pausing before they entered the courtroom. Ebony inhaled, remembering her days in law school, the countless hours spent rehearsing moot court cases. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied. Across the corridor, Todd Harrison stood with his union-appointed attorney. He looked pale, dark circles under his eyes, hinting at sleepless nights. The attorney, a stocky man named Alan Rice, spoke in low, urgent tones. "We'll argue that you had reasonable suspicion. You need to present yourself as calm and professional. No outbursts." Todd clenched his jaw. "I understand." When the hearing began, the judge's gravelly voice echoed through the high-ceilinged chamber. It was a preliminary hearing to address the merits of the lawsuit, whether it should proceed to trial, and if so, under what conditions. Ebony and Todd each took the stand to give their accounts. The tension was palpable. Ebony's testimony was measured, clear. She recounted the events, the unwarranted stop, the threatening demeanor, the unlawful attempt to search her vehicle, and the moment Todd grabbed her arm. Yvette methodically introduced video evidence taken by bystanders. The footage played on a large screen, showing Todd's hand forcefully gripping Ebony's wrist, her startled reaction, and the crowd's outcry. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. When Todd took the stand, he tried to maintain composure. Under cross-examination by Yvette, though, cracks appeared. She probed his motivations, asking detailed questions about his suspicions and whether Ebony's race influenced his actions. "Officer Harrison," Yvette said, "isn't it true that you have a history of conducting stops based on vague suspicions, particularly targeting minority drivers?" Todd's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the question. Todd shifted uncomfortably. "I stop anyone who seems suspicious. Race has nothing to do with it." Yvette showed a log of Todd's traffic stops for the past year, indicating a disproportionately high number of stops involving black drivers. Todd tried to dismiss the data as coincidental, but the pattern was hard to ignore. The judge's expression grew stern. The hearing lasted several hours, with Ebony's legal team meticulously building a case that Todd's actions were rooted in bias and that the department failed to properly oversee his behavior. By the session's end, the judge concluded that there was sufficient cause for the lawsuit to proceed. Outside, reporters swarmed. Ebony and Yvette delivered a brief statement, emphasizing that this was about systemic change as much as individual accountability. Todd, meanwhile, slipped out a side entrance to avoid the press. Returning home that evening, Ebony felt drained but resolute. She knew the road ahead, depositions, further hearings, a possible trial, would be long and grueling. Yet she also felt something else. Hope. Hope that this case could help drive the reforms she'd always championed, that it might do more than just hold one officer accountable. Todd Harrison sat alone in his living room, the lights off, a faint flicker from the TV casting shadows on the walls. Linda hadn't come home yet. She'd sent a text saying she needed space. The union attorney had warned Todd that the department might distance itself from him to protect its image. He felt the walls closing in. A single question haunted him. How had he let his life unravel so completely? As the lawsuit progressed, the pressure on Todd Harrison intensified. More evidence emerged, painting a clearer picture of his track record: an unusually high stop-and-frisk rate targeting black drivers, several citizen complaints that never escalated beyond internal memos, and a handful of disciplinary warnings for minor breaches of protocol. While none of these prior incidents had been as explosive as Ebony Brooks's case, together they painted a damning narrative. The Philadelphia Police Department, under immense public scrutiny, moved to protect its broader reputation. They began to hint that Todd was a bad apple rather than a reflection of systemic issues. Chief Carla West, in an effort to show transparency, announced that Todd Harrison had been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The move sparked both relief and cynicism among activists who believed the department was sacrificing one officer to quell demands for deeper reform. Todd's personal life fared no better. His wife, Linda, had spent weeks living in a hotel, telling him she needed time to think. Now that his paycheck was cut off, Todd found himself struggling to cover bills, let alone finance a legal defense. A few of his old guard friends in the force offered quiet words of sympathy, but nobody stepped forward with tangible support. Todd's union lawyer seemed increasingly detached, as though he expected Todd to lose and was merely going through the motions. One late afternoon, Todd visited his favorite bar near Fishtown, hoping to drown his sorrows in whiskey. But as soon as he walked in, he felt eyes on him. The bartender, a man Todd had known for years, looked at him with disapproval. Over in a booth, someone whispered, "That's the guy who grabbed that councilman's daughter." The shame was suffocating. Todd quickly paid for his drink and left. Meanwhile, Ebony Brooks experienced her own emotional roller coaster. Though she received an outpouring of support from community groups and individuals who praised her bravery, she also had to endure relentless vitriol online. Anonymous threats landed in her inbox. Some accused her of using her father's political clout for personal gain, while others hurled racial slurs and vile language at her. Each hateful message hurt, but she refused to be intimidated. Instead, she channeled her energy into her philanthropic work, meeting with city leaders and non-profit organizations to address police reform. Eventually, Todd's day of reckoning arrived. At an internal hearing, the department laid out its case. Evidence, testimonies, and the official stance of the chief herself made it clear that Todd's conduct violated multiple policies. The panel voted unanimously for termination. Todd Harrison was stripped of his badge and escorted out of the precinct he'd served for a decade. The news cameras were there to capture the moment. Todd, head bowed, walking out of the station into a sea of flashing lights and shouting journalists. "No comment," he muttered, pushing his way through. In that instant, he realized how profoundly he had lost, not just his job, but the respect and identity that came with it. The fallout was swift. The mayor's office praised the department for swift and decisive action, a statement Ebony Brooks found only partially satisfying. Yes, Todd Harrison was held accountable, but she knew the problem was bigger than one man. Her resolve deepened. This case would serve as a catalyst for lasting reforms, not just a sacrificial offering to appease the headlines. For Todd, Karma's blow was more painful than he ever could have imagined. He retreated to a cramped motel on the outskirts of the city, living off his meager savings. Each night, he turned on the TV and saw Ebony Brooks, or Councilman Brooks, discussing police reform, or talk show hosts dissecting his downfall as an example of how prejudice can destroy a career. It seemed that every screen, every paper, every social media feed reminded him of his sins and the harsh price he had paid. In the months following Todd Harrison's termination, the city of Philadelphia witnessed a wave of changes and conversations around policing. Councilman Reggie Brooks, buoyed by public support, introduced a comprehensive police reform bill that emphasized stricter oversight, enhanced training on implicit bias, and more robust accountability measures for officers. The bill won the mayor's backing, and after spirited debate in City Council, it passed with a strong majority. Ebony Brooks found her name at the forefront of many of these discussions. Though she never intended to become the face of police reform in Philadelphia, her lawsuit and her courage in speaking out had galvanized activists and community leaders. Her philanthropic organization, the Brooks Community Advancement Foundation, channeled new donations into community policing initiatives. They launched forums, training workshops, and scholarship programs aimed at fostering better understanding and trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Officer Morales and Officer Chang, who had been witnesses to the fateful traffic stop, testified openly about the events they'd seen. Their honesty helped shape the department's new rules on de-escalation and bias training. Chief Carla West, hoping to rebuild public confidence, mandated that every officer undergo a monthly workshop addressing cultural sensitivity and the history of systemic racism in policing. It was a start, far from perfect, but a step in the right direction. As for Ebony, her personal journey also took unexpected turns. While she had always been committed to social justice, she realized that her platform now carried more weight than ever. She found herself invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even universities. During one speaking engagement at Howard University, her alma mater, she became visibly emotional. "My experience showed me how quickly a routine day can become a life-altering event," she told the audience of bright-eyed undergraduates. "But it also taught me about resilience, about using every resource we have to make our voices heard." Meanwhile, Todd Harrison was a shell of his former self. His marriage to Linda officially ended in divorce. He moved back to the same row home where he grew up, trying to take care of his ailing mother. Local newspapers occasionally printed updates about the civil lawsuit Ebony had filed, which Todd's former union lawyer was still trying to fight in court, albeit with diminishing enthusiasm. Todd lived in dread of the final judgment. One early evening, Ebony attended a community gathering in a local church basement, part of a series of town halls on police reform. She was shocked to see Todd Harrison sitting quietly in the back. He looked thinner, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow. Curiosity mingled with discomfort as Ebony's gaze caught his. He offered a small nod, a silent gesture of acknowledgement. After the meeting, Ebony found him loitering by the old bulletin boards near the exit. She hesitated, then approached. "Officer Harrison?" Todd, she began tentatively. He shifted, avoiding her eyes. Just Harrison now, he muttered. I'm here to learn. Thought maybe, I don't know. I can't fix what I did, but I wanted to understand. Ebony took a breath. It would have been easy to dismiss him, to hold on to her anger. Instead, she said, "Understanding is the first step." Todd met her gaze for the first time, his voice cracking. "I was wrong. I know that now. I'm sorry." They stood there in silence for a long moment, two individuals on opposite sides of a conflict that had changed them both. For Ebony, forgiveness was not a quick fix. It was a process. She remembered her father's words. Real change begins when we face our faults. Before she turned to leave, Ebony gave Todd a quiet nod. "Thank you for coming. Keep learning." And with that, she slipped out into the cool evening air, leaving Todd with a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long while, the possibility of redemption. In the months that followed, both Ebony Brooks and Todd Harrison traveled drastically different paths toward what could only be called a new beginning. For Ebony, her civil case concluded with a substantial settlement from the city, money that she immediately directed to the Brooks Community Advancement Foundation. Standing at a podium in front of a modest building in West Philadelphia, she announced the construction of a new community center that would offer legal aid services, job training, and a forum for dialogues between law enforcement and residents. "We're calling it the Reconciliation and Hope Center," she said to the gathered press and neighborhood onlookers. "It's not about forgetting what happened, but about preventing it from happening again." Applause washed over her as she cut the ceremonial ribbon alongside her father, Councilman Brooks, and Chief Carla West, who had come to show her support. Chief West used the moment to highlight the reforms already underway within the Philadelphia Police Department. Body cameras had become mandatory. A new civilian review board was being established with the authority to examine complaints and recommend disciplinary actions. Training protocols had been revamped to place greater emphasis on empathy, communication, and de-escalation techniques. The city's mood seemed cautiously optimistic. While systemic problems rarely vanish overnight, the momentum felt tangible. Community leaders, activists, and officials finally appeared to be working in concert to bridge a divide that had stood for decades. For Todd Harrison, life was more complicated. After the town hall meeting where he'd briefly crossed paths with Ebony, he found himself drawn to more of those gatherings. At first he attended sporadically, sitting in the back, listening to people's stories of interactions, both good and bad, with the police. His presence didn't go unnoticed. Occasionally, community members recognized him and confronted him, sometimes angrily, sometimes tearfully. Todd learned to listen, to let them speak their pain. It wasn't easy. Guilt weighed on him like an anchor. He remembered each time he'd pulled someone over for suspicious behavior, each complaint he'd dismissed. The data that Ebony's lawyer had exposed in court haunted him, his stops of black drivers disproportionately high, his justifications nebulous at best. Unemployed and burdened by the cost of lawyers, Todd took a job as a night security guard at a construction site. It was a far cry from his days patrolling the streets with a badge, but it paid some bills and gave him long hours of solitude to think. One night, he found himself leaning against a chain-link fence, gazing at the Philadelphia skyline. He recalled how he once believed he was carrying on his father's legacy, but the more he peeled back the layers of his own motivations, the more he realized that his father, for all his flaws, had also been a man who genuinely wanted to serve and protect. Todd's brand of policing had become corrupted by cynicism and bias. Eventually, Todd reached out to Officer Chang, the younger officer who had tried to stop him from escalating his confrontation with Ebony. Despite their differences, Chang answered Todd's call and agreed to meet him for coffee. They sat at a small cafe near Chinatown, Chang still in uniform, Todd in faded jeans and a hoodie. Chang sipped his tea thoughtfully. "I'm glad you called. I always wondered if you were okay. The media painted you as a villain, but I knew there was more to it." Todd fiddled with his paper cup. "I was a villain, Brian. I screwed up, and I've got to live with that." Chang studied him for a moment. "I don't condone what you did, but maybe now you can do something good. There are programs, some are run by Ebony Brooks's foundation, where former officers come in and talk about their mistakes, help train new recruits to avoid those pitfalls." A flicker of interest lit Todd's eyes. He wasn't sure if Ebony or her foundation would even consider him, but the idea of sharing his story as a cautionary tale had merit. If his experience could prevent even one future incident, maybe he could reclaim some shred of dignity. In the weeks that followed, Todd mustered the courage to reach out to Ebony's foundation. He filled out an online form, outlining his background and his willingness to share his story. To his surprise, he received a polite but measured response from one of the program directors, inviting him to speak at a workshop on implicit bias and de-escalation training for new officers. On the morning of the workshop, Todd arrived at the new community center Ebony had funded. The building was spacious, walls covered in bright murals, celebrating diversity and unity. Todd noticed a sign with Ebony's photo, commemorating her leadership in driving the project forward. His stomach churned. He felt like an intruder in a sanctuary he'd tried to violate. Then Ebony herself walked in, exuding confidence, yet not without compassion. She approached Todd, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm glad you could make it," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. Todd hesitated, then took her hand. Thank you for letting me be here." She studied him for a moment, as if gauging the sincerity of his regret. "We're committed to change, Todd. All of us. But change only works when people are ready to face the harm they've done." Nodding, Todd felt a lump in his throat. This was his moment of reckoning. "I am," he managed to say, voice trembling slightly. "I am ready." Over the next hour, Todd spoke to a room of newly minted police academy graduates, some wide-eyed, some skeptical. He told them about his career, his biases, the moment he let prejudice dictate his actions. He described the shame he felt, the pain he caused Ebony, and the ripple effect that destroyed his life. The rookies listened intently. Some asked respectful questions, others thanked him for sharing. Todd could see the weight of his words on their faces. He realized that maybe, just maybe, he could help shape the future of policing, not by being the model cop he once fancied himself to be, but by being the cautionary example of what happens when prejudice and power intersect. When the session ended, Ebony approached Todd again, offering a faint smile. No grand gestures of forgiveness were exchanged, but there was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that real transformation is messy, it's slow, and it requires honest confrontation with one's faults. Their story would never be a simple one, but in that shared space, it was clear both Ebony and Todd were part of a greater narrative of a city striving to become better. One step, one conversation, one moment of reckoning at a time. What began as a routine traffic stop ignited a storm of truth, pain, and ultimately transformation for an entire city. Officer Todd Harrison's split-second choice to target Ebony Brooks exposed a systemic problem, one that transcended two individuals and demanded justice, accountability, and reform. Through courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right, Ebony didn't just stand up for herself, she opened the door for a wave of change that touched countless lives. And though Todd's downfall seemed absolute, even his darkest moment sparked a new understanding of the insidious consequences of bias. It took a hard fall for him to see the light, and a determined woman to show an entire system the cost of prejudice. If you found inspiration and hope in this journey of turmoil and transformation, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge and uplift us all. We appreciate your support.